Welcome back, everybody. Welcome if you're new here. This is going to be a quick video, fingers crossed. I know in the last month or so there hasn't been a ton of content out, but this winter break there's going to be a ton of videos. I've got a million ideas, especially going into 2025. I'm probably going to do a video just explaining some of the stuff I'm going to do in the next couple of months relating to research projects, interviews with authors, my own stories, and hopefully novels that I'm currently working on. I'm going to try to do some writing. Anyway, I'll explain that all. That should be the next video probably. But yeah, so I'm back home. Room is still a mess. I don't know if you can see that or not. Hopefully not. I just submitted my very last final, which was my Nabokov course. Done with the Nabokov content. As much as I have loved doing that, I don't think reading Vladimir Nabokov, 6 of his novels is what I would have chosen to put on this channel. But as I said, the school stuff goes on here, and hopefully you guys found some of that interesting. I do kind of have an updated opinion on Lolita as I've had time to marinate on the book. And it's tough to put stuff out so reactionarily. I don't know. I guess that's the truest form, is I've read the novel. This is how I felt while reading it. This is how I feel immediately after reading it. And here are my thoughts. But I do have some thoughts after discussing it with some friends and things like that. But anyways, I finished Palefire, which was the last book I had. My Russian class was just more Tolstoy short stories. So Palefire, done. And then I submitted, it was a short story I was working on. One of your essays for this class can be a creative project. So I decided to write a short story from the perspective of John Shade, the poet in Palefire, which if you don't know who that is, I will explain this whole novel. Not really, I'll just explain the concept overall. It was a very frustrating read, but very fun. Not 5 stars, but close. When I was writing the story, I was kind of done with the Nabokov course, so I don't know how good it is, but I did enjoy getting to let out some of my frustrations I think Nabokov wants you to feel into the short story I was writing. It was interesting. I think an essay might have made more sense for this, but I wanted to save my creative project for the end of the semester when I had all the other papers and things like that. And so maybe I'll share the short story if I revise it a little bit too, for anybody who's interested. But yeah, so Palefire takes place at a university. Wordsmith, is it? I think it's Wordsmith College. I could have that wrong. I have some notes that I'll pull up in a second. But it is 2 fictional authors. So the first is John Shade, and you get this poem by John Shade that's made up of 4 cantos, 4 parts. It's in heroic couplets, which is very, very strange. If you can kind of see, that's the style. And what's interesting about this book, I think, is that Nabokov was translating and commentating on Evgeny Onegin by Pushkin. And so this whole novel seems to be about the idea of commentary, of interpretation. Yeah, it's interesting. So it must have been something that he was thinking about a lot. I know that his was kind of the first big translation of Evgeny Onegin, but if I remember correctly, he translated it very directly, and so it wasn't it didn't rhyme, and so it wasn't a poem. I don't know, somebody correct me on that, but the translation I read from the Oxford Classics I really loved. And so I guess I was in that heroic couplet mood, but I love the poem. I loved the poem. John Shade's poem was really well done. The first line, "I was the shadow of the wax-winged sleigh," and just stuck in my mind. I really love that. And it's a 999-line poem, and the last line is insinuated to be that first line. It's set up that way, so the reader fills it in, which is kind of interesting. And you read this poem, and it's this life story, and the poem is it's really, really good. Nabokov wrote a really good poem. So it's the life story of this guy, John Shade. I'm probably going to spoil this book a little bit because it's so insane, and it was spoiled for me, and I didn't really read anything because of how insane it was. I feel like I spoil all the books on this channel, so maybe find someone else to watch if you don't want spoilers, because I can't seem to control myself. But it's about this guy, John Shade. It's from his perspective. He's telling his life story. He's talking about his wife. He's talking about his art. He's really reflecting, the main thing is his daughter, who killed herself, and probably did so in connection to how he and his wife treated her it doesn't make a lot of sense because it seems like he's saying like she was ugly, and so we kind of like cast her aside, which is just insane. But at the same time, I don't know, I do feel bad for Shade in this context. It's a very wacky thing overall, but the poem is really beautifully done, and you can see this insane amount of guilt that he feels, and the idea of like being a great artist versus being a great person, and the way that he can conjure up emotions, but like does he, you know, how he enacts them in life. I don't know, I mean, I just underlined so much of it, and it was just so pretty, and I just love these. I really do love this format, but it is odd, you know, to see a modern-ish story, you know, a guy in the 60s or whatever. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, this is not anything special, but I'm just looking at what I've highlighted. Like, while the automaton is taking off what he has just put on, or walking briskly to the corner store to buy the paper he has read before. My best time is the morning, my preferred season midsummer. I once overheard myself awakening while half of me still slept in bed. And then I realized that this half too was fast asleep. Both laughed and I awoke. It's just like, there's some funny things, and then there's some really heartbreaking things. And he's questioning God, whether his daughter is still alive somewhere. He doesn't seem to believe in God, but at the same time, he can't like make amends with the idea that like his daughter isn't somewhere waiting for him. I don't know. It's just, yeah, it's really heartbreaking. So, anyways, the point is you get really invested in this poem, and then there's a commentator. If you want no spoilers, stop here. But I think this is fascinating. I want to talk about why it frustrated me so much. Even though it shouldn't, because of how like insanely absurd it is. There are some theories that I will lay out that are like widely recognized by like Nabokov scholars and things. Like the idea that there's this guy, Botkin, who only gets mentioned by last name here, I think, in this book, but he's the only like person in at the school who that Shade teaches at who seems to have any agency in the novel. And there's a thought that like Charles Kimboat, who's the commentator, is actually someone that Botkin has invented, or even the idea that Botkin has invented both of them, both Shade and Kinboat. So anyway, but I'm going to leave that out. That's not the interpretation I took, although I see why people think that way. And obviously I couldn't take that from my short story because I had to use the two characters. So anyway, the idea here is that Shade becomes friends with this Charles Kinboat, who moves into a house that the judge of this town has rented out while he's abroad. And Kinboat, according to himself, we read the foreword actually before we read the poem, and the foreword is, I don't know, there's tricky things there, but also like you kind of take it for what it is because you don't know any better yet. But he's like, well, me and Shade like became best friends in the span of 6 months, and because he's now dead, I am going to publish this poem that he gave to me, and I'm going to talk about it. And or no, he didn't give it to me. I like went over to his, this is the tricky thing that you learn right away, which is like I went over to his wife, Sybil, his widow, was like, I know this poem, give me the poem, sign it off to me or whatever immediately. Yeah, so it's a tricky situation because he basically has full control over Shade's work, rights to publish it. And we know that other scholars are very against this idea and think that he's completely screwing everything up. But he's insisting Shade and I were best friends. We learned that he really has no friends at the college. Everybody kind of hates him. Shade's the only one who tolerates him. That's kind of thrown in like the context of like Shade's feeling really bad about alienating his daughter and what that did to her. So maybe he's just not alienating Kinboat. But essentially they're hanging out. There are hints that Charles Kinboat is not taking when he goes over to Sybil as John's wife, so Sybil in John Shade's house, and is like being told to leave, not invited to certain parties. When they're trying to go somewhere for vacation, and he needs to know where, and he needs to know like what cabins are available nearby, and so it's pretty crazy. And then he thinks he's the king of a fictional country called Zembla. And essentially, the whole point of this book is Kinboat interpreting Shade's poem through all of the tales that he told Shade about how he was the king of Zembla, how he was forced to flee, lovers, friends, enemies, assassins coming for him. He's convinced that because he was blabbing about this to Shade, which is probably why Shade didn't like him and everybody else literally could not be around him, he can't accept that Shade wrote the poem about himself. He's like, no, this big last poem, it's got to be about me. It's got to be about the stories I was telling him. So he'll take, I can't even get into this. I'll probably do a video as well on the way I annotate books and things like that, because people have asked about that. But like this one is nuts. Like I'm just like mad. Like I just can't stop writing in all caps. And it's so frustrating the way that he goes line by line in Shade's poem. And so it'll be like, he says here, I could make out. And then he, Kinboat, is analyzing it, and he says, by the end of May, I could make out the outlines of some of my images. And so he just goes on his own tangent, completely unrelated. He will take a word. Oh, here's this tree. Well, this is the kind of tree that was in Zembla, and this was... So it's insane, and it's really fascinating to think about. I want to hear people's thoughts on the whole thing. If you've read it before, I hope I didn't spoil it for anybody. I hope I gave fair warning. But... It's a really fascinating concept, and this is, I think, Nabokov at his best, because he's so intelligent and really likes to play games with the reader. And while it can be a bit too much for me sometimes, I mean, this is what he was made to do, and this is kind of, I think, like the text that is hyper aware of itself existing as a text is kind of like what postmodernism is, even though that word doesn't really mean anything anymore. And so reading John Barth right now, it's like this is kind of where it started. Everything is like post-Nabokov, is kind of like postmodern. And it started with this because of how like this is I feel like this is like the text that was super experimental, super avant-garde, whatever you want to say. I mean, all these words mean nothing anymore because of whatever. I don't want to rant about this, but the 80s, 90s, 2000s, whatever. Anyways, Palefire is fantastic. I would highly recommend reading it. It is unlike anything I've ever really read before, and it is one that I would like to have not read so fast, which is what happens with some of this class stuff. But happens, gotta do it, and I enjoyed it, and I'm sure I will come back to it at some point. Probably not this copy because it is so marked up. Yeah, I don't know. I wanted to like read some stuff out, but again, when I've got the whole book underlined, it's hard to do that. And a lot of this turned into like being marked up for the short story I was writing, like very focused on what scenes I could use and things like that. But yeah, I don't know. I really liked it. And I'm sorry for whatever's going on outside. Probably just some work or something, but again, I mentioned like my perspective being changed with Lolita, and it doesn't really change how... It's changed in the sense of what like Nabokov is trying to do, if that makes sense. Like I feel like the reaction and the fact that people are taking a book like that as a love story, which if you're somebody who doesn't take it that way, you might not believe that it even could be, but I mean it is. And like, I think I mentioned this before, like you go on Google and you look up like those like little lovey-dovey quotes and frames, like there's a million of those from Lolita, and it's like people are buying that, like it's just crazy to me. But at the same time, the idea of making the reader insanely uncomfortable and as uncomfortable as possible and having to sit with that and realize that people like this do exist is a very interesting concept. So I have decided, final take on Lolita, I don't want to think about that book again, but that seems to me what he's trying to do. And it is okay that there's not somebody behind Humbert showing you. I don't know, it's tough. It's tough because you just can't, a book that's that popular, it's just, I guess what I'm saying is I respect the idea of it, of the idea of trying to make people as uncomfortable and like sit with these like this awful person like in his head, but it just, again, I guess it doesn't work because of how it's read and how widely it's read and how different people have interpreted it and how when it got popular he kind of went along with certain interpretations. But I guess that's my final thought, is that like I don't hate Lolita as much as I maybe said I did. I think it's interesting. I don't think I enjoyed reading it, but that's kind of what I've decided in my head I think Nabokov was trying to do. Anyways, enough Nabokov on this channel. There's been far too much. This is a video I wanted to get done, put out, and be done with him for a little while. But I hope you guys enjoyed some of it. Again, with his stuff, really like Palefire. Would recommend reading The Illusion Defense. I did a long video on that if you're interested. And his other stuff is interesting as well. I think you've got to be really interested in puzzles and deciphering things and pausing to look up words and pausing to research references and things like that. So it's just, he's an interesting writer. By no means my favorite, but really interesting stuff for sure. And I'm glad I took the class. Glad I got to write about different stuff. Maybe I'll share this short story. And I'll be back later this week with another video and then another after that. There will be a lot of videos over my winter break. So stay tuned if you're interested. And thank you all so much for watching. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this and anything else you've been thinking related to books or whatever in general. Anyways, yeah, thank you all so much.